Somewhere across the rolling plains of France in the summer of 1944, German panzer commanders developed a peculiar and calculated fear. It wasn't the roar of Sherman engines or the whistle of artillery shells that terrified them. It was the deadly silence that preceded the slow, deliberate movement of an American turret. When they spotted the distinctive silhouette of an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer emerging from behind a hedgerow, veteran German tank crews knew they had exactly 80 seconds, just over 1 minute, before that massive 3-inch gun could swing around to face them. This wasn't just another Allied vehicle rolling across the battlefield. This was a machine that would fundamentally change how armored warfare was fought, not through overwhelming firepower or impenetrable armor, but through a design flaw that became a tactical advantage. The M10 Wolverine's manual turret traverse system, initially seen as a cost-cutting measure by American engineers, created a psychological weapon more powerful than any high-velocity cannon. German tank crews found themselves trapped in a deadly game of chess, where every move had to be calculated against the ticking clock of that slowly rotating turret. The story of the M10 Wolverine begins not in the factories of Detroit or the drawing boards of Aberdeen Proving Ground, but in the smoking ruins of France in 1940. As German panzers rolled through the Ardennes, American military observers watched in horror as French tanks, superior in armor and firepower, were systematically destroyed by coordinated German anti-tank tactics. The lesson was crystal clear. Tanks needed dedicated hunters. By early 1942, the US Army had committed to a revolutionary concept, the tank destroyer doctrine. Unlike traditional tanks designed for breakthrough operations, these vehicles would be purpose-built killers, fast enough to respond to enemy armor threats and powerful enough to destroy any tank on the battlefield. The M10 was born from this philosophy. But what emerged from the Fisher tank arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was something nobody quite expected. Built on the reliable chassis of the M4A2 Sherman, the M10 stretched 19 feet 7 inches from nose to tail and weighed in at a hefty 65,200 pounds. But it was what sat on top that made all the difference. An open-topped turret housing the most advanced anti-tank gun America had ever fielded. The heart of the M10 Wolverine was its 3-inch M7 gun, a weapon that could punch through 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, more than enough to penetrate the frontal armor of any German tank except the massive Tiger Y. This wasn't just another tank gun, it was a precision instrument of destruction. The M7 fired a 15-pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, generating enough kinetic energy to turn steel into molten fragments. Each M10 carried 54 rounds of this devastating ammunition, stored in racks throughout the fighting compartment. But raw firepower was only part of the equation. The M10's designers had made a critical decision that would define its entire combat career. The turret would rotate manually, not electrically. While German tanks like the Panzer IV could traverse their turrets in 15 seconds using electric motors, the M10's crew had to physically crank their turret through a complete 360-degree rotation. This process took exactly 80 seconds of continuous cranking, requiring the coordinated effort of multiple crew members. To German tank crews watching through their periscopes, this slow, methodical rotation became a countdown timer to their own potential destruction. Staff Sergeant Robert Tank Morrison of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion would never forget his first encounter with a German Panzer IV near St. Vith in September 1944. "We spotted this Jerry tank about 800 yards out, hull down behind a stone wall," Morrison later recalled in a letter to his wife. "My gunner, Corporal Jenkins, started cranking that turret around while I called out the range. The German crew must have seen us because they started backing up, trying to get to cover. But here's the thing. They had maybe 90 seconds before our gun would be on target, and they knew it. You could almost feel their panic through the periscope." The psychological impact of the M10's slow turret traverse created a unique form of battlefield terror. German tank crews found themselves in an impossible situation. They could see death approaching with mathematical precision, but they couldn't always escape it. The M10's top speed of 30 mph on roads meant it could reposition faster than most German tanks, and its relatively low profile, just 8 feet 1 inch tall, made it difficult to spot until it was already in firing position. Once that turret started moving, German crews had to make split-second decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. The M10's crew of 5 men operated in a carefully choreographed dance of destruction that had been perfected through months of training at Fort Hood, Texas. The commander, positioned in the right rear of the turret, served as the eyes and brain of the operation, identifying targets and coordinating with infantry support. The gunner, seated to the left of the main gun, operated the manual traverse mechanism, a hand crank that required 80 complete rotations to swing the turret 360 degrees. The loader, positioned behind the gun, had perhaps the most physically demanding job, hefting those 15-pound shells from the ammunition racks and ramming them into the breech. In the hull, the driver controlled the vehicle's movement, while the assistant driver operated the radio and served as the crew's link to higher command. What made this crew truly deadly wasn't just their individual skills, but their ability to anticipate enemy movements. Experienced M10 crews learned to position their vehicles so that the turret was already facing the most likely avenue of enemy approach. They studied German tactical manuals captured in North Africa and Sicily, learning to think like their opponents. When a German tank appeared, the M10 crew often had their gun trained on the target before the enemy even knew they were there. The numbers behind the M10's combat effectiveness tell a story of American industrial might that German intelligence officers found almost impossible to believe. Between April 1942 and December 1943, American factories produced 6,706 M10 tank destroyers, more than the total number of tanks Germany manufactured in the entire war. The Fischer tank arsenal alone was turning out 12 M10s per day at peak production, working 3 shifts around the clock. Each vehicle required 15,000 pounds of steel, 2,400 pounds of aluminum, and 180 pounds of copper, materials that were becoming increasingly scarce in Germany by 1944. The M10's Ford GAA V8 engine, producing 400 horsepower, gave it a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to climb 60% grades and ford streams up to 3 feet deep. Its fuel capacity of 165 gallons provided an operational range of 200 miles, meaning M10 units could operate independently for days without resupply. But perhaps most importantly, the M10 cost just $58,000 to produce, less than half the price of a German Panther tank. This economic advantage meant that for every Panther Germany could field, America could deploy 2 M10s with money left over for ammunition and fuel. Lieutenant Hans Kruger of the 2nd Panzer Division learned the hard way why German tank crews had begun calling the M10 der langsame Tod, the slow death. On October 15, 1944, near Aachen, Kruger's Panzer IV was advancing through a bombed-out village when his radio operator spotted movement in the rubble 600 yards ahead. "Amerikanischer Panzerjäger!" came the urgent call. Through his commander's cupola, Kruger could see the distinctive open turret of an M10 Wolverine, its long gun barrel slowly swinging toward his position. "Rückwärts! Schnell!" he ordered his driver, but the narrow street offered no room to maneuver. For the next 70 seconds, Kruger watched helplessly as the M10's turret crept toward his tank with mechanical precision. His own 75mm gun couldn't penetrate the M10's frontal armor at that range, and his driver was struggling to back the 25-ton Panzer through the debris-filled street. With 10 seconds left on his mental countdown, Kruger made a desperate decision. He ordered his crew to abandon the tank. They tumbled out of the hatches just as the M10's 3-inch gun fired, sending a 15-pound projectile through the exact spot where Kruger's head had been moments before. The psychological impact of this encounter would haunt German tank crews for the remainder of the war. The M10's open-topped turret design, initially criticized by American tank crews accustomed to the protection of enclosed fighting compartments, proved to be a tactical advantage that German engineers had never anticipated. The 360-degree visibility provided by the open turret allowed M10 commanders to spot enemy movement that would have been invisible to crews buttoned up inside traditional tanks. Staff Sergeant William Eagle Eye Patterson of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion became legendary for his ability to detect German armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. "You could see everything," Patterson explained in a post-war interview. "The way dust kicked up behind a hedgerow, the glint of sunlight off a periscope, even the exhaust smoke from an engine starting up. We had eyes like hawks up there. This visibility advantage was enhanced by the M10's sophisticated optical equipment. The M70F telescopic sight provided 5x magnification, allowing gunners to identify specific German tank types at extreme ranges. The commander's M20 binoculars offered 6x magnification and were specifically designed for target acquisition in European terrain. But perhaps most importantly, the open turret allowed for instant communication with supporting infantry, a capability that proved crucial in the close-quarters fighting of the Normandy hedgerows and the urban warfare of German cities. The M10's baptism of fire came during Operation Torch in North Africa, where American tank destroyer battalions first encountered the legendary German Afrika Korps. Captain James Desert Fox Mackenzie of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion recorded the first confirmed M10 kill on November 23, 1942, near El Ghouta, Tunisia. His target was a Panzer III IUSF-SL, commanded by Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns. The engagement began at 200 yards, when Weber's tank emerged from behind a sand dune, its 50mm gun searching for American targets. Mackenzie's crew had been waiting in ambush for over 2 hours, their M10 positioned hull down behind a rocky outcrop. As Weber's panzer advanced, Mackenzie gave the order to traverse. For the next 45 seconds, the two crews engaged in a deadly race against time. Weber's gunner fired 3 rounds, all falling short as the German tank struggled to find the range. Meanwhile, Mackenzie's gunner methodically cranked the turret, the M7 gun's muzzle creeping toward the advancing panzer with mechanical inevitability. At exactly 800 yards, the M10's gun fired. The 15-pound armor-piercing shell struck the Panzer III's frontal armor at a perfect 90-degree angle, penetrating completely and detonating the ammunition storage. Weber and his crew had no chance to escape. This engagement established the tactical template that M10 crews would follow for the remainder of the war: patience, precision, and the psychological advantage of inevitable destruction. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the M10 Wolverine had evolved from an experimental tank destroyer into the backbone of American anti-armor doctrine. The 3rd Armored Division alone deployed 36 M10s during the initial assault, with each vehicle carrying enough ammunition to engage 54 separate targets. The bocage country of Normandy, with its maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes, seemed tailor-made for M10 tactics. German panzer crews found themselves trapped in a landscape where every field corner could conceal an American tank destroyer, its crew patiently waiting with stopwatch precision. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter of Panzer Regiment 12 described the psychological impact in his diary. The Americans have turned tank warfare into a science of time. When you see that open turret beginning to move, you know exactly how long you have to live. Some of our crews have started abandoning their tanks the moment they spot an M10, rather than face that terrible countdown. The bocage fighting revealed another crucial advantage of the M10's design. Its relatively narrow width of 10 feet allowed it to navigate the tight confines of Norman lanes, where wider German tanks became trapped. This mobility advantage, combined with the psychological impact of the slow turret traverse, made the M10 the perfect weapon for the close-quarters fighting that characterized the Normandy campaign. The M10's impact on German tank doctrine became evident in captured Wehrmacht training documents from late 1944. German tank schools began teaching specific countermeasures against American tank destroyers, emphasizing rapid movement and coordinated attacks designed to exploit the M10's slow turret traverse. Panzer crews were instructed to approach M10 positions from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the American crews to choose which target to engage while leaving themselves vulnerable to the others. However, these tactics required a level of coordination and communication that German forces increasingly lacked as the war progressed. Fuel shortages meant that German tanks often operated individually rather than in coordinated formations, making them vulnerable to the patient, methodical hunting tactics perfected by M10 crews. The psychological impact of the M10's presence on the battlefield extended far beyond its actual combat effectiveness. German intelligence reports from the period describe widespread Wolverine anxiety among panzer crews, with some units reporting combat effectiveness reduced by up to 30% simply due to the fear of encountering American tank destroyers. This psychological warfare aspect of the M10's design had never been intended by its creators, but it proved to be one of its most effective weapons. As the war entered its final phase in 1945, the M10 Wolverine had fundamentally changed the nature of armored warfare. The slow, deliberate rotation of its turret had become a symbol of American industrial might and tactical innovation. German tank crews who had once dominated European battlefields now found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing that somewhere in the distance an M10 crew might be patiently cranking their turret into position. The M10's legacy extended far beyond its wartime service. The lessons learned from its deployment influenced the design of post-war American tank destroyers and established the doctrinal foundation for modern anti-tank warfare. The psychological impact of its slow turret traverse demonstrated that in warfare, the perception of inevitability could be just as powerful as raw firepower. Today, military historians recognize the M10 Wolverine as more than just another World War II fighting vehicle. It was a weapon that turned time itself into an instrument of war, proving that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is not through speed or surprise, but through the terrible certainty of methodical, unstoppable precision.